Hello everyone, welcome to Process Change Communication and Training Tips. I'm so glad that you've decided to join us, and I'm glad to be back. Last 2 months we had guest presenters on and I missed you all. So I'm glad to be back, and we have a number of really good webinars coming up, which I'll introduce you to in just a moment. But I want to give you a special shout out and thank you to those of you from across the globe where it's very, very late or very, very early. I think we've got about 25 countries represented. So thank you for sticking in outside of work hours to hear the webinar live. It's often fun to be able to ask questions real time. So let's get going. And just for a few of you that are new that don't know me, we have a firm. It's been a firm for about 22 years now, and a whole team of people with mainly Lean and Six Sigma and Deming style quality management backgrounds. And we help clients in all stages of an implementation or transformation journey, primarily using Lean, although we do use sprinkled tools from other areas as well. And we do everything from help support internal teams that want to deepen their own skill set to organizations that are just starting the journey and haven't built any sort of support resource or infrastructure. And we lead improvement as well as helping them get that infrastructure established. And you can see there on the screen 4 books done and 1 in the making. My next one, I'm just starting the outline for it. It's going to be on clarity, which is one of the chapters in the Outstanding Organization. I'm going to do a deep dive on clarity, which also includes transparency and the truth and all that good stuff. So it's fun. And then also, if you haven't subscribed yet, I welcome you and encourage you to subscribe. We don't bug people with a lot of marketing garbage. It's really a very content-rich service that we offer, and our monthly webinar, our monthly newsletters are pretty popular. So please, share it with your friends and subscribe if you don't already. And then if you want to see anything that's coming up for webinars coming up, you can go to our website on the webinar page and you'll see a registration button. I just added last night a new one for January 21st. Dan Markovitz is the author of the new book, Building the Fit Organization, and he's going to be a guest host that's going to just give us a little different perspective on how to view any type of improvement process through a fitness lens. It's really a very, very good book that I encourage you to buy right now so you can be all prepared for January. Okay, so let's get going. Well, this is a topic I'm very passionate about because I have 2 fundamental drivers and missions that have, set me up doing this career that I've been doing for so long. One belief I have is that we make work incredibly more difficult than it needs to be. And I mean we, meaning organizations, maybe not you specifically, but certainly, those around in terms of how we view process. And we have a lot of very strong habitual ways of dealing with process, or in my view, not dealing with process, that needs to be changed in order to make work a lot easier, a lot more fun, a lot more fulfilling. And so I have a deep passion to help organizations transition to that kind of a work environment. The other thing that I'm a very big passionate person about is this whole respect for people notion that's one of the 2 pillars of the Toyota production system and the lean management system, the other one being continuous improvement. And respect for people goes far beyond how people are treated and talked to and those kinds of things. It's really very much about how easy it is to get their jobs done, how well processes are documented and followed so that people don't have to go through unnecessary burden when they're working. So it's very tied to process design. What we're going to talk about today in the webinar, I have to make a little confession here. So the webinar was originally going to be just communication and training of new process improvements. And as I was developing the webinar, I realized that I just could not stick to those 2 topics. And so it's a much broader webinar than I originally planned. But we are going to talk about common points of failure with improvement rollouts that start all the way up with the original planning before the improvement was even made. We're also going to talk about communicating change, and a lot of the points of failure I see with organizations assuming that just because they tell someone that something should be done new, that they'll just automatically do that. We all know that doesn't work, right? And then training delivery tips. There are a lot of, quote, training programs out there I see for new improvements that are very ineffective. I'd like to talk a little bit about how to make them more effective. And then finally, what you need to be doing to manage processes on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're continuously improved and that people are following these processes that have gone through a kind of scientific approach to improving them. And this is something that is the most important of everything I'm going to cover today is this last bullet point. If you don't manage the processes, they will go into a state of chaos. That's just the nature of life, and it's certainly the nature of processes. So part of, if you wonder why you got a lot of chaos going on in your organization, it's because your processes are not being well managed. So let's dive in. 8 points of failure I have defined for improvement rollouts and why the improvements, don't stick or don't work well, and why performance doesn't really get any better, and why we go back to the drawing board 2 years later after we've put a lot of time and effort into making improvements. So one reason is that there's a very, very common problem where people that have to absorb the new way of operating have no clue why it was necessary in the first place. So let's talk about the importance of why and unclear purpose. I talk about this a lot in the Outstanding Organization about having clear purpose and mission and how that helps galvanize a workforce and everyone can achieve their goals and the expectations that organizations have for business performance much more easily than being unclear and having ambiguity around it. So one of the things that we see with process design is that people that are leading improvement often assume that people can see why it matters and why an improvement needs to be made. But I just had a call yesterday with a Fortune 100 senior VP who is so frustrated because two of his peers are not really buying into the whole notion of a continuous improvement process that's a little more scientific and formalized and standardized and all those things. And what we really got down to in the conversation was that these folks don't really understand why that is necessary and why their processes aren't where they need to be. And they happen to be a company that's fairly successful. And of course, comfort and success is probably the most dangerous place for an organization to be when it comes to continuous improvement. So it always starts in the beginning. In fact, Simon Sinek has such a wonderful book called Start with Why. And it's very important. Stephen Covey was also very big on it, and I'm very big on start with why. And so people need to understand why the improvement is needed in the first place. Well, how do you define that? Well, it's very easy to get people to clearly understand why if you use numbers and you're defining a problem or an improvement opportunity as a gap between where you are and where you need or where you want to be. Numbers are powerful. And when people see where you're currently performing, it's kind of undeniable that improvement is needed if the numbers aren't where they need to be. So getting clear about that gap and defining it in terms of numbers would be very helpful to get people to understand why improvement is needed in the first place. You need to make an extremely compelling case because as you know, those of you that lead improvement, as you know, leading people into a change situation isn't easy. It's not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of thick skin. And so the thing that you want to do is help make it easier along the way. And having this, metrics-based gap identification and clarity around why the improvement is needed is critical. So this because you can answer the sentence, we need to reduce or increase some sort of a defined measurement or metric from X to Y because blah, 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 blah. You can answer that question so that people can understand what's the driver here. Is it customer experience? Is it financial? Is it morale? Is it market share? What is the reason why we have to do this? That is the key to starting. A charter, as those of you who are familiar with our approach, we are charter fanatics. We have charters for everything, and they vary somewhat depending on what they're being used for. This happens to be a value stream mapping charter, but the reason why we find charters so important is that it gives clarity and brings light to why something is important. So the charter has different sections in it, and the left side is pretty much answering the questions what and why. What are we doing and why do we need to do it? And in particular, you see this section here, current state problems and business needs. That helps everyone involved or everyone who's going to be affected by an improvement know up front, if the charter is properly socialized and communicated, why the improvement is needed in the first place. And then the goals and measurable target conditions, everyone knows going into the improvement what you're trying to achieve from a measurement perspective. That right there helps bring clarity to the process much more easily than not having a charter and not socializing a charter. The other thing that happens is the poor involvement part of it is critical. You have to have people who are the subject matter experts heavily involved in the improvement, or the improvements won't stick because they won't view them as being valid. So going back to the charter for a moment, you see this who section. Again, right from the beginning, you can make sure that you're including at least one representative voice from each of the functional areas that either provide information or material into the process that's being improved, or they're the downstream customers of that process that's being improved. And you need to cast your net fairly broadly to make sure that you don't avoid, or you don't eliminate or forget someone that's in that whole kind of chain of supplier-customer relationships internally. Critical that the right people be involved up front, or no process is going to have a chance of standing on its own 2 feet when it hasn't had that cross-functional holistic view. So then the next thing, so let's just assume now that you've done the improvement. You had a clear purpose, you had the right people involved, you used all the proper problem-solving techniques and tools, and you got a lovely new improvement in place. We're skipping past all that hard work, and now we're going to fast forward to now what do you do? So you either had a project that lasted many months, or you had a Kaizen event that lasted several days, or you had some combination thereof, and now you're ready to roll out the new improvement, whether it's something that's a process, a step-by-step process, whether it's something in a physical environment, any of those kinds of things are a need to properly communicate and roll out the improvement. I'm actually going to take a little quick step here and look at there's a couple questions coming in that seem like I should answer before I move on. So one question was the expected release of Clarity, the new book. It's not titled Clarity, just to be clear about that. It's probably going to be a year in the making. I'm just in the very early stages, and it takes about 9 months to get a book kind of written and through the whole editorial process and into production. So it'll probably be about a year. I'll know better in about 3 months, so keep asking. And then the next question was the charter. Yes, the charter is, so those of you that are subscribers probably are aware of the area you can go to for all of the templates and assessments and all of the things that we offer subscribers. Those of you that aren't subscribers, subscribe, and in the thank you that you get, there will be a link to that place on the site. And if you don't remember where to go ahead and let me know, and I'm not going to announce it publicly because this webinar will be viewed by thousands of people after the webinar, and I think that you should subscribe in order to have access to the charter. The next thing is on the VSM charter and the mapping team, how do you determine if the team members have the bandwidth to participate? So good question, Christine. What I recommend you do is go to the immediate supervisor of the person you want on the team, and don't even think about including someone on a project team until or if you've gotten that person's support for the person and you have an idea of how many hours it's going to take for their involvement. Make sure that you have clearance for that person to be involved, because that is pretty frustrating to get who you think are the right people and then you can't really get them at a week into the project. They're suddenly pulled off because they don't have the bandwidth. There's a whole lot to the whole team development that we won't have time, unfortunately, today to go into, that it needs to be fairly strategic in how you pick people for your teams. It's a good question. All right, so now back to the documentation part of this. This is, the first and one of the fatal flaws I see so much, that people, go through the hard work of getting a new process designed, and then it's not properly documented, and it's not accessible to people, and it's not used for onboarding new hires, and it's not used as a living document where you're constantly making improvements to it and then re-socializing that with the people who do the work. I mean, process documentation is key. And I've got to tell you, I mean, this is one of those things where as a consultant, you kind of scratch your head where, we've been at this for decades upon decades upon decades upon decades. And still, every single time I start with a new client, I find that they either have 0 processes documented, they have them all documented and only 20% are current, or they have maybe a couple documented in a little pocket that seems to be doing better with process management than others. But it is a common problem, and it just is a little bit of a head scratcher on why anybody would believe that you could perform at a top level without having clear documented processes that show people how to do the work well. So what I recommend is that you have some sort of a standard format across an entire company, and if not the whole company, start with a division or start with a department. And I recommend highly that you have some sort of a standardized header at the top that includes revision or version control, so that people know how current it is, and a process owner, an actual person's name, one person, not two, and you'll hear who that is and how you select them later in the webinar. I tend to like a dual column format for any kind of written process where visuals are key. So you want to make sure that you have the steps themselves described and then visuals. I'll show you a couple of examples in a moment here. But it needs to be standardized, and I'm a big believer in centralizing all the standard work for an entire organization. It's not centralized in terms of who controls them and manages them and owns them, but the actual storage of the electronic versions of these, I believe very strongly should be centralized. Here's an example of one that we use in my company, in the Karen Martin Group, and this is, you don't see the whole header and all this. I just picked one of the areas that had better visuals and more clear visuals. So this is actually how we go about putting together value stream maps for clients so that they have a standard look about them. And this happens to be, one of the first steps is just starting the file, and how, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and when you need to show a visual where it helps clarify what the step is, you do. If you don't need to show a visual, you don't include it just for the sake of a visual. You're very thoughtful and purposeful on when you're including visuals. So you can see this happens to be a 2-column format. For companies that have very intense data screens, like in engineering, technology, any of the highly technical, even healthcare actually has really jammed screenshots, then you sometimes have to go to one full width type of environment where you have the steps written all the way across, and then you use the full width of the page for the screen captures so that they're readable. They do need to be readable. That's an important thing with standard work, that you can actually read it. So this is one example. Now, another thing is, it's legit to have standard work not look like that in, technology, in mechanical environments, in anything where there's a physical product as opposed to information that's being handled. This is another example of standard work. You'll notice that they have it pretty well done. The one thing I see missing here is version control. They've got an original date, or maybe this is their update date, but I like to see the original date, the document was created, and then which version we're on right now. So this is another version. Here's another version where it's a vertical step-by-step process with some pictures. This is just examples of people we've picked up along the way. Here's another one. This is a checklist. So checklists are also a form of documenting a process, and this happens to be a landscape style, a beautiful checklist to, excuse me, to increase the quality of surgical outcomes. And then here's another one that's an outpatient procedure guideline for a healthcare system where they use laminated cards on a ring, and these are just sitting on a little hook right in front of the people's little nursing station where they're at, and it has different categories of information they need to be able to do their process as well. So that is a different, unique way of documenting processes. And then there's another version of a checklist. This happens to be a new hire orientation checklist, and that's a form of standard work as well. But the one thing that this one is missing is who does it. So who's the one that's going through this checklist? What date was it created? What version are we on, etc. So that's really important to keep that information on there. And then this is another example of something we've got here, and since we're on a webinar, I decided to pull the webinar standard work, and I wanted to share with you, if you're not familiar with Google Drive or Dropbox or any of the cloud-based systems, and you can even do this on just regular Microsoft Office programs. You can do this on Word as well. You can create the means for it to hyperlink a content outline that you can click on it and then jump to that page. And this is what a lot of my clients I recommend, and they're doing, and they're finding it being really helpful to be able to have the standardized processes in an area electronically stored, in this case, for this kind of a process, and then you can just quickly jump to wherever you need to go. And you can just see, again, steps, visuals, steps, visuals. So that can give you an idea of how you could form this. Another question that just came in, could you elaborate on the difference between standard policy and standard work? I think sometimes policy tries to be both. Yeah, I do view policy and work itself as separate, but I tend to like to incorporate the policies right in the standard work so you don't have to have two different documents. So you can have, a section that's all about, decision trees, for example, levels of authority required for some sort of review. Those kinds of things you can incorporate right into your standard work so you've got one-stop shopping. I recommend it. All right, so documentation is key. It's unique and specific to every process. There's no standard way that I recommend every single process look. It is situational. Well, once you get it documented, now you have to figure out how do you roll it out and communicate it. Communication is very close to training, and I have training in quotes here for a reason, which I'll get to. But the communication piece of it is something that companies fall down on a lot. So one thing I see a lot is that people believe that if they just tell someone to do something differently, it's going to stick. And it just doesn't. I mean, that's not how the human brain works. That's not how psychology works. If you don't have all those other preconditions in place, like people being clear on why it was needed and people being clear on, who was involved in it and did the right input get shared, and is the process even right? I mean, the improvement, is it really an improvement or is it a change? So we need to make sure it's truly an improvement. And then it has to be documented. You can't just tell people how to work. They have to have a visual documented place to go and learn the steps, especially for processes that aren't done every hour of the day, especially for places where people are coming in and out, there's high turnover or maybe even temporaries that are being used, especially in an organization that has very, very strong continuous improvement, because you're constantly changing the process and you can't possibly rely on that tribal knowledge and to have any semblance of control and organization in an organization. So telling is not an effective way. Now, in the other ways of rolling out a process, of course, there's always going to be a telling component, but telling alone is a miserable point of failure. The other thing I see a lot is email. I see a lot of people, creating a new standard work document, for example, and then they just email it around to all the people that do the job. And, of course, the problem with that is that, first of all, people have fairly poor retention on email, and sometimes they don't even open emails, so you're not even guaranteed that they know that the process was changed, let alone that they absorbed the steps of it. So that is kind of like telling. You don't want to roll out process improvements via email. If you have a remote situation and virtual employees all over the place, then you may need to have email as a component of your process rollout, but never as the sole means of communicating an improvement. So let's talk about training, and I'll go back and forth between training and communication because it's linked. So when you hear the word training, think about it for a moment. What do you think? What does training mean to you? Most of you probably are thinking about people in a conference room or a classroom, and there's a teacher at the front, and they're, basically using PowerPoint or something to show the new process. Well, that may be part of what's needed in a complex change. That may be needed, but it cannot stop there. There's a whole lot more needed for people to operate a new way. You're asking people to think a new way and to operate a new way. And just hearing someone drone on in the front of a class about how to operate and think a new way is not going to do it. It has to be interactive. There has to be a lot of discussion. There probably need to be materials. And in many cases, there needs to be hands-on actually doing the process. And that's true in information and knowledge environments as much as it is in manufacturing, healthcare, or anything where there's a little more of a physical element to it. So we're going to break my little rule of not having bulleted and wordy PowerPoint slides. I've got two back to back, and it's because there's just too much to put content around every single one of these. But when you're planning for some sort of a process rollout, I recommend you take these 6 questions and don't rush through them. Think very hard about what is the objective of this quote training or rollout. What do you want people to know? How do you want them to behave differently? What specifically do you want to see them do differently in the new improvement, once you roll that out? And then the other question of who needs to know and why, and what specifically do they need to know? Not everyone needs to know the same information. So people who are actually working the new process need a whole different level of information than people who are feeding into that process or are customers of that process. Everybody needs to know something that's connected in the chain, but the detailed work of step 1, step 2, step 3 may only be needed by a subset of the people who need to receive training. So you need to be clever and creative about how you roll out training and not subject all the people that are in the I just need to understand, generally speaking, what's going on, be dragged down by the details that only those that are doing the work really need to know. And then the question is, when do they need to know it? So if you're going to roll out a process on a Monday, a new process, you really can't decide to train on Monday. You have to train a couple days before that and make sure that on Monday morning when they walk in, they are highly competent and proficient in doing the new process. So that is another thing. I see this level of proficiency, very, very poor, to where people are expected to just kind of intuit, I guess, that the process is new and they aren't really given proper training and preparation and given time to absorb a new way of operating. The other thing is you have to think about the best way to deliver information. So in the case of a remote situation where you've got people all over the place, WebExes are fine, but if you look at the research on WebExes, I wonder how many of you are doing email right now. How many of you are doing email right now? Raise your hand. Yeah, thank you. Some of you are being honest. So, this is what happens on WebExes, is that people aren't focused on what's going on, and you have to make sure that you have people that are going to be having to perform a new way focused. So WebExes may be necessary, but they have to be highly engaging, very interactive. There needs to be a lot of Q&A throughout so you can engage people. If someone's being silent on a WebEx, you need to draw them out. Hey, Joe, are you there? Do you have any questions? Are you understanding this? Does this make sense? Do you have any improvement ideas? You have to be really helpful and draw people out in a remote situation. And then finally, and most importantly, how are you going to know if it was any good? How are you going to know if they achieved the learning objectives that you set forth because you did great planning? How are you going to make sure that on Monday morning, when they have to come in and do the process a new way, it doesn't explode in your face? So it's really important to think about, how do you assess yourselves as well as the process itself. So there's a question, good question, busted. Okay, Liz was doing email. By the way, phone calls are actually better than webinars according to brain science. That is true, and thank you, Liz, for raising that point. It's true that people are more engaged and more focused when they're on a phone call than when they're staring at a screen and they're on a WebEx. So think about that. Another question is, for solution, this company is talking about a cloud-based system. Oh, so as for solution, are we talking about a cloud-based system for communications and process improvement? Yeah, it doesn't have to be cloud-based. I mean, it could be a shared drive situation that's hardwired. I'm not making any kind of judgment on cloud versus hardwiring, but it just needs to be a shared system that people can access. And it needs to be a system that you can lock down rights so that only certain people have editorial rights, and that would be the process owners. So now let's talk a little more about the process rollout. So the one thing to think about is that there's a whole lot that's required in order to have a successful process rollout. It's not just about the training. It starts with the documented processes like we talked about. It has to include some sort of conversation with interaction and Q&A. Demonstration of the new process absolutely needs to be there. Even if you're rolling out a process that's not done frequently, you need to demonstrate it, and then you probably need to offer the training or the rollout again just prior to that process being done. So annual budgeting, for example. If you make an improvement in July and the budgets are due in October, you're probably going to have to do some sort of indoctrination. Oh my God. Oh my God, why am I having a hard time with that word? But you know what I mean. Indoctrinate. You have to indoctrinate people to the process before they do it, right before they do it. practice I mentioned, a designated source. Now we're going to get into process ownership in a bit here, but there needs to be either a super user group or some sort of process ownership designees that once the process rolls out, people know very specifically who to go to. And if it's more than one person, you need to make sure that group is tightly woven together so that they can periodically share it to some sort of a single source, what are all the issues people are having? And then depending on the severity of the issues, that will determine how quickly you go through another round of improvement. So if there's something that you roll out a new process on Monday and people are really struggling with something, it may mean that you need to reconvene a group quickly on Monday afternoon, tweak the process, roll it out again, and get it going in a new way on Tuesday. Or it might be that you've got a lot of learning curve issues where people are just having a hard time getting used to things being on a new screen in the computer system or something. You need to give them some time, but collect all of those and then take a look maybe 3 weeks into a new process and look at the collective group of suggestions for improvement you've gotten and then figure out what to do from there. So make sure that those people are physically close to where the work is being done if possible. In a remote situation, you can't always get that to happen, but really if you're rolling out a process in an area and it's a new complex way of working, you're best suited to send someone, fly someone to the work areas in order to get them having real-time questions and real-time responses. Question is, do you recommend try-storming the process prior to rollout? Yeah, of course. You know, this is plan, do, study, adjust. So there needs to be experimentation and testing and a reflection on the testing. It's plan, do, study, adjust always and forever. Okay, then the last thing is a designated source for improvement ideas, and that means for the ongoing improvement ideas. So there can be overt problems that occur right after rollout, and there could be just, people get excited when they see a new way of operating that's easier. They don't have to be the turtle on the skateboard. They sometimes come up with lots of new ideas, and you want to have a place for them to take those ideas and then a way to act on them as quickly as possible. All right, enough of my bullets. Sorry about that. All right, so the next thing is I like to use a work plan for pretty much everything. And this is what a format I've been playing around with for a couple years that is the communication and learning work plan for a new process rollout. So there are three slides here. This is an Excel document that's very vertical. So I like to take a look at, which processes are we going to be helping people learn about and learn how to do? Which are the functional areas that need to be involved? And there, you can have more than 2 levels of learning needed. I tend to like to keep it kind of simple, and that there's awareness, which is the what and why. What are we doing this for? What are we doing? And then the how would be maybe a subset of that group that also need the awareness as well. Who's going to teach? What kind of learning format or delivery format are they going to do? Is it going to be, just classroom? Is it going to be classroom with WebEx? Is it going to be hands-on? What's going to happen there? Where and when are these sessions going to be held? And by the way, very often we'll just divide and conquer an improvement team and go physically to the workplace instead of having people come to a conference room. So sometimes, especially if you've got a case where you've got no backup, or you've got multiple shifts, or you've got people that really can't take any time away from the job, you have to go to them and teach them in their location what the new process is. Always, always, always start with learning objectives. What do you want the people to know that are in the awareness category, or how do you want them to think differently? What should they be able to explain versus the details of what should they be able to do? How are they behaving differently? What are they doing differently? So be very clear about that, and I think more than 5 gets a little bit of overkill. And then, there's the training materials needed, and that means like what physical things are people going to need? They might need printouts of standard work instructions. I think companies, I'm all for the environment. I love the environment. I'm a recycling fanatic, blah, blah, blah. However, I do think that the companies that I've been working with over the past 2 years, by and large, are over concerned about printing and under concerned about results. A lot of people are very visual and they like to make notes, and their learning happens more deeply as a result of making notes and doodling. And if they have questions, they might want to put the question mark, right next to a visual of the process step, and they may not need to ask it right away because they want to see if you're going to cover it later, and those kinds of things that make people just staring at a screen. It's very passive. Great way to get people to zone out, and it doesn't make, in many cases, for the most effective learning. So be careful that you don't overdo the no paper thing. And then finally, 15 steps for the action plan. This could be any number of steps. This just happens to be, one client and what we set up for them, but there's a whole number of things that have to be done and people that need to be involved in rolling out a process, and sometimes people just don't think about this level of detail needed to really roll out the process well. Is the work plan available for downloading? You know what? It will be. I want to tweak it a little bit more, and if you subscribe, stay tuned for a download link in next month's newsletter. I will provide this, but I want to do a couple more things to it that I ran out of time this morning on. All right, and then the next thing is the whole ownership thing. So this is where I'm going to do a little butt kicking. Well, I guess I've been doing a little butt kicking. This is something that kind of surprises me. It's a little bit of a head scratcher at how hard it is for an organization to embrace the notion that there should be a single owner for every process and a single owner over an entire value stream. When you have functional areas, you can't have each functional area be responsible for their function, or you'll never get holistic improvement in place. It just isn't possible. So there needs to be cross-functional ownership, and this is also where you have to forget what the org chart says and do the right thing. So if the org chart says that, Sally doesn't report to Joe, Joe oversees finance, and Sally has a process which has a piece of finance in it, oh well. Sally's been given the authority. She should be recognized in the organization as having that authority for process ownership, and she's not mandating how the finance part of that process operates. She's really just minding the store and serving as the doctor, the physician of that process. So when you think about it, what does a physician do? A physician, let's say you've got a chronic condition, let's say diabetes. So a physician is looking at your blood, your glucose levels and your A1C levels on a regular basis. They start going downhill, you course correct, change medication, increase, decrease, change it all together. There's a constant monitoring going on. We don't do this with processes. Why? I don't know. But we have to, and there has to be someone that's minding the store. So if you take a look at this value stream map, this is it's a value stream map for a capital equipment designer, basically. There is manufacturing, but it's only the last step of the process. You'll see color-coded borders here. So the blue color-coded borders is one person, the green is one, the gold is one, and the pinky purple is one. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 process owners in this value stream. The value stream also has one champion for the entire value stream. So Nancy's responsibility is to look at the performance of the value stream overall at a high level, and the blue person's job is to look at the blue blocks and make sure that they're performing well, and so on. Sometimes you have to take it to a third level within each one of these, and there might be sub-owners within it, but most of the time you can stop at this level and have one over the whole value stream and then a couple of different people over process chunks in the value stream. Now, how I like to look at this, in addition to color coding so it's obvious on the value stream map, is you can take in a very, very complex value stream, you may want to break it into chunks and have a value stream manager for each chunk and not have one for the full value stream. This would only be if it's very, very big value stream. Like in the case of the entire patient experience in a hospital, that would be a bit much to have one value stream owner for all of that. And then each one of the value stream segment owners has a series of processes that are in their segment that have individual process owners for that. So this is a way to get people that are closer to the work, and they tend to be a little lower level or in the organization. They might be supervisors, they might be managers, they might even be frontline that have been given the responsibility because they like process documentation and management, and they're an up and comer. Is that up and comer? I think that's what it's called now. And so you might want to have someone that's even directly in the front lines. So you can do whatever you want as long as it's well documented so people know who owns what part of a process. The other thing to think about is that when you're figuring out these process owners, their job is going to be to watch that process on a pretty regular basis. And we're about to get into visual process KPIs, key performance indicators, but they're going to be primarily determining up front with a team what are the things we're going to measure to tell whether we're doing well or not, and how are they going to be visually displayed so that the whole world knows how we're performing. And that the whole movement to visual management is a whole change management process in and of itself, because it brings transparency to places that sometimes people aren't comfortable having that level of transparency now on a wall for all to see. But it's a good way to surface problems, and it's the only way to operate if you want to be outstanding. I'm going to take one more question here. So as a consultant, what methods have you found effective for engaging top-level executives in an organization? Well, that's a whole subject onto itself. Good question, Jason. From a value stream perspective, I won't do value stream improvement unless I've got C-level leadership sponsorship. So, it's as an outsider and as someone who has written books and things like that, I have a little more clout when I go in sometimes that say, no, this is how you've got to do it, or it won't be successful. And so I tend to ask for that sponsorship up front. Another good question is, which of the 8 would be the biggest offender? I'd wager missing or weak ownership because the rest could follow it. Good question, Andrew. Let me see. Is there one? So you're saying which is the biggest offender, meaning the most common or the worst for the process? I think they're kind of equal. And I think that they're sequential in a way. If you have unclear purpose, then the whole thing kind of falls apart. But probably the measurement and monitoring is even more offensive. Having no measurement and monitoring is probably even more offensive than not clear ownership, I think. That's a good one. I need to noodle on that a little bit more. The other question was about process ownership and whether the FTE has 100% accountability for a designated process. No, these people are not full-time FTEs. In fact, they should not be. Anyone from your improvement team, your KPO, your lean office, whatever you call your improvement team, if you've got one that's dedicated, these people, the ownership should not be from that team. They need to be the line managers, supervisors, leads in the actual work being done. And they tend to begin having a little bigger chunk of responsibility because it's new, and there's usually a lot to get done initially. So it could occupy up to 20% of someone's time for the first few weeks. I've seen that, but it usually rolls back to 10 or 15% once you get rolling and you've got some process stabilization. Good question. Okay, so let's talk about this measurement. What do we do? All right, I am in the middle of working with a client right now on establishing KPIs for a huge part of their organization. It's a full value stream, and it's a really big one. So I'm kind of immersed right now in this. It's really been fascinating to go through this process with them. So there are 3 criteria for really good process management. One is the defined and documented processes. We already talked about that. One is 2 to 5 relevant key performance indicators, KPI, key performance indicators for each process. They need to be visually displayed. It does no good to hide them in the computer. They need to be consistently measured. It does no good to define them and then not actually measure. And they need to be consistently improved. They need to drive consistent improvement for the process, or there's no point in measuring at all. And then finally, sole ownership or oversight for pieces of the process, with, of course, backup when that person's on vacation. So the guidelines for the KPIs, 2 to 5 max, and this one I want to talk about, the number 2 here, measuring performance versus volume. So what I mean by that is very often when people are just getting used to defining KPIs, they'll think that looking at the volume of work coming in is a KPI. That's only true in certain circumstances. So if the process you're trying to measure, for example, is a sales process, then it could be that the number of sales coming in is relevant because it's a direct measure of effectiveness. So that might be a good way to do it. If you're trying to reduce, if there's a process that's broken or not working as well as it could, and it's creating the customers having to submit tickets, you may want to see the number of tickets as a KPI because that's a direct reflection on improving the process so they don't have to ask for things to be fixed in the first place. That could be valid. But just looking at the volume of work coming in because you want to see if you need to increase staffing, that's not a key performance indicator. That's necessary to track and to be able to look for staffing reasons, but it's not a process measurement, or not at least one of the 2 to 5. The other thing about the 2 to 5 is that you can have 20. If you're a manager over an area, you can have 20 different things you're looking at, but they aren't the 2 to 5 that get on a dashboard that are the kind of singular focus you want everyone to have in order to get a process working well. You only want 2 to 5 max for that. And so you can have drill downs. In fact, there's some pretty cool things you can do on Excel where you can link worksheets and you can have, your big KPI that's on a dashboard of some sort, then link to a drill down that gives you more and more information, and fewer people need that drill down. So what I'm talking about for these 2 to 5 is what's going to go on a visual dashboard for the whole world to see. So now let's look at the thing about, well, what kinds of KPIs. So what you want to do is keep the 2 to 5 heavily weighted toward operational and customer experience, because customer experience is what Lean is all about, voice of the customer. And you can have some financial and market share. You can have turnover KPIs if you're trying to correct a high turnover situation. You can have other things, but they should be pretty heavily operational and customer focused. Make sure that you also don't get locked into your KPIs being the same KPIs for 20 years. You want your KPIs to change, not frequently, but as the needs change, and you want to shine a light in a new area where you're having kind of consistent problems, you want to be able to shine that light. And remember, problem isn't necessarily, someone's aorta is gushing blood in the organization. Problems are a gap between where you are and where you'd like or need to be. So change your KPIs as you want to change the focus on closing gaps, but don't change them too frequently, because once you switch them out, if you stop looking at them, they often can deteriorate and go back to a point of chaos. So here's an example of what I'm using with teams to help them define KPIs, just to give you some background here. Usually we have several sessions that are half days or so, where we have the new process owners, once they've been selected, come into the first session having brainstormed all the possible KPIs that could be used to monitor the processes or process that they're responsible for. And they'll come in with sometimes a list of 20 or so, and then through asking questions about, what problems are the customers experiencing? What problems are you guys experiencing internally? What is it that we want to see? What's the gap we want to see closed? And oftentimes there's a direct tie between in a value stream transformation effort, there can often be a direct tie between the performance measurement that was set up front for the value stream and looking at current versus future state and the KPI. Once you get to a process level, usually there hasn't been any kind of defined KPI up front at the value stream level, because you're drilling down now to process level. So I like to tie them to, if you're using a value stream map, tie them to the process block on the map, and then state what the process is, who owns it, what this KPI is going to give you a measure of. In this case, we've got 3 customer experiences and 2 cash flows, what the KPI itself is, and what the metric is, and then how frequently it's going to be reported, and then what the target is, or in some cases, a low target and an upper target. So in the case of inventory, for example, if you're operating with a pull system, you're going to want to have a safety stock level and a maximum stock level. So sometimes there's a lower and upper. In the case of equipment, temperatures, for example, it can't go below a certain temperature and it can't go above a certain temperature, etc. So it could either be a single target or it could be upper lower. And then what you could have here is take a looking at visual management in general. There are 4 purposes of visual management, but we're only talking about here number 3, which is showing the performance of the process or of the people. So you can take a look at this. Visual management is a whole nother topic into itself as well, but this is just going to focus on the performance piece. So I'm going to just quickly flash through some examples of some visual management where you've got targets and then reported real-time metrics to look at how close you are to a target. There's this kind of a version, and you can take a look at these later. I'm going to go kind of fast here. Here's one where you've got a clear target, which I like. I like trend charts, line charts, progress charts. They have all kinds of names. I like these a lot better than a typical just numbers because it's more visual. So you can see if they're above or below target really easily. I also like to see once let's just say that they're supposed to be below. And by the way, this doesn't indicate which direction is the right direction. So that needs to be added here. But when they're off target and there needs to be active visual showing that problem solving is in the works. So I'd like to see that on this one. This is an interesting visual that we found in a company that was having a pretty high turnover, a high absenteeism. And so this is a visual they started putting in place to look at when are people there with, or not there, sorry, yellow is not there for a portion of the day, and when are the red where they're not there at all. So that's a nice visual to see, and you can see how it actually does start getting better as time goes on here. Here's another one where there are 4 different metrics that are very close, and you'll see, where they are as far as, range. And of course, this one is one that they're working on right now to, serious problem here to get it down into this range. So visuals with these lines that showing the targets is really helpful. Here's another one. This happens to be at the company-wide level. This isn't even just value stream. It's even bigger than that, where it's, right when you go in the door and when you get to the top of the stairs, it shows all the KPIs for the entire company. And what was interesting about this, that when we did the snapshot, this company was privately held and still being very transparent about EBITDA and sales per employee and DSO. I mean, pretty interesting that they were being this transparent and really a good sign. You can use bar charts, although again, I think line charts tend to be a little easier to see. If you're going to use a bar chart, definitely put some sort of a target so people can see, where you are in reference to where you should be. And then lastly, there's poor continuous improvement as the final thing, and that's, rolling out a process brilliantly that's never improved doesn't make it right. So what you want to do is just have that process owner constantly watching the metrics and constantly going through PDSA circles and not waiting for an annual process check or a quarterly process check to see if it's performing well. This needs to be real time, which is why it does take a bit of effort and some dedication and bandwidth. And if you do that, you don't have to do process audits. That's the other thing that's interesting about this, is that if you properly manage processes on an ongoing basis, you don't have to have a third party coming in and monitoring processes unless it's a regulatory requirement. And so, it makes it easier to be always doing better and always striving for better performance on all fronts. So with that, I'd like to just refer you to a couple of different places. And we talk about process ownership in all books, but it's not as deep as what you got today. But these are the page numbers in all 4 of the books if you have any of those or want to buy any of those to take a look at some of the more detailed information. And then there are 2 webinars I did earlier, one in 2012 and one in 2013, that are on the webinar page. Here's the link here if you'd like to take a look at those. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do, because we have webinars and the newsletters are pretty content rich. Would love to have you be able to get that information in real time. And we've got 7 minutes left for questions. Those of you that have been on these before are probably used to them being 1 hour and 15, and I decided to experiment with 1 hour and see how that went. So I'd love to hear from those of you that are regulars how you liked the hour versus 1 hour and 15. So questions are coming in here. Let's see. Could you elaborate on the difference between, oh wait, I'm sorry, I already did that. Let me do the next one. Trainees practicing the new way. I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Tom, if you can elaborate, that would be great. Okay, hang on one second. Let me get down to the new questions. By demonstration, do you mean piloting it? Oh, good question. No, I don't. But pilots are important. So pilots are, what you do when you have a process that needs to be improved and it's going to affect a lot of people or it's going to be really, really big. You pilot it with a narrower scope of the work before you roll it out everywhere. So for example, if you have in a manufacturing environment, if you have lots of different SKUs or item types, item numbers, you may not want to roll out a whole process to all of them at once. You might want to target it with one subset of the SKUs or one manufacturing line, not all of them, or one market segment, not all of them, that type of thing. In healthcare, you might want to have it for outpatient imaging. Instead of doing it all, you may want to work just with CT scans or just MRI or just mammograms and roll out a process there first, etc. So that's what a pilot is. By demonstration, I mean you're actually in the rollout demonstrating the new process, and the people, to a large extent, the people are actually doing the new process. And so you're watching them, and that's part of the training is the learn, do is really important. So just learning cognitively and hearing about a new process is very different from doing the process, and you're going to build new habits far faster and far deeper by having them do the new process. Next question, how can we measure effectiveness of communication, virtual communication messages delivered by a central location to multiple sites in a tight timeline? Yeah, good question. You do need to measure for sure, and it really depends on what the communication is on how you measure it. So if, for example, you're communicating a new way of operating, then, first of all, you wouldn't be doing it just virtually. You'd be having some sort of a, on-site help of some sort that can be with the people, but you would want to see how the process is performing after the training. I'm a big believer in giving at least 5 little questions or 3 to 5 questions at the end of training that help give feedback on how effective the customers of the training, which are the participants, how well they thought it was. You'll see 3 questions when you exit this webinar, and we take your responses very, very seriously. I mean, we need to all practice continuous improvement all the time ourselves, since that's what we're preaching, right? So you can ask the people, really it's the process performance that will tell you. And the other thing is, when process performance isn't going in the direction you'd like it to be, make sure that when you're doing root cause analysis for why the gap still exists, that you look at, at whoever conducted the training and the methodology used for the training and the rollout and the way it was communicated. Look at that as a possible root cause on why the process isn't performing well. I hear all too much, hey, they knew what they were supposed to be doing, they just chose not to follow it. I don't buy it. People are not wired that way. People want to do a good job, and if you do the proper laying out all the way from the why and you have the right people involved and all that, people are not going to resist. You'll see in one of my older webinars I say, if people are resisting change, you've done something wrong. When you do things right, people don't resist change. So next question is, do you recommend, okay, we got that one. Hang on, let me go down here. Let's see. Next question is, management of a company wants me as a consultant to assess their production process and identify improvement opportunities. Although interaction with operators is important in identifying process issues, management team do not wish me to discuss the purpose of my presence with the operators. Well, they're not going to get very far. If people don't, I mean, trust is really important. If people don't know why you're there, they're going to fill in that gap with horrible thoughts. And horrible thoughts are going to make them behave poorly. And so, you need to be transparent on what it is. So I guess my question to you would be, why are you there? If it's to improve the work, to help the workers be able to be more successful, that's a pretty honorable goal. Why not share that with the operators? If it's to lay people off, that's not an honorable goal, and that's going to be tough to involve them at any level if they know that a layoff is the thing coming after it. When I'm faced with, in the few times I've been faced with a layoff situation, I say, you know what, do your layoff first, and then I'll come in and I'll help you, get better processes and get a better performance with the people who are left. So I would just challenge, what is the purpose of you being there, and why can't that purpose be clear? Next question. I like the attendance tracker. How did the employees embrace the visual board? You know, it was an interesting one. There were a couple of people, this was a union environment also, and there were a couple of people that really dug in at the supervisor level. And this was one case where after lots and lots of kind of lobbying and talking and trying to gain consensus, they were never able to get the supervisors to really agree to it. And so the way we approach these things is we say, would you be willing to live with it for 30 days and see what happens? And if they say yes, then we roll it out and we promise to readdress the issue if it's not working within 30 days. And in 99.999% of the cases, it is working well within 30 days. Next question. Would you mind going back one slide so we can see the name of, oh yes, sorry. Yep, the other webinars. There you go. Is there a recommended frequency for introducing new processes? Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on the size of the company. I recommend really keeping a good eye out for Kaizen fatigue or process change fatigue in general, and I think it depends on how big the processes are and how broad they are. So if it's a very cross-functional process, and there's lots of people involved, it's a big company, you probably don't want to do one major change per 2 months, maybe 3 months, maybe a quarter. If it's a smaller company and the process changes are a little more isolated, you might be able to roll out one a month, but you have to be willing to change your plans. Every single client I work with, they go to the buffet, they see all the food, and they take too much. And I try to talk them out of it, and they say, no, we can do this. And my strategy as a consultant is to let companies learn on their own. And so every single one of them mid-cycle starts backing down a little bit on some of the dates, and they slow down a little bit. And I think it's a good thing. So two more questions. Where it's 12:01. I'm going to just take two more here. Do you ever encounter employees who resist implementation of a new standardized process and use the sentence, I don't want to be micromanaged? If so, how do you suggest we deal with this? I don't. I've heard it from many people, but I think the reason why I don't is the way we roll out process changes. And the people that are going to be part of the new process are involved with the upfront chartering. They know why the process needs to be tweaked. They've been given data to help them understand it. And so they know, even if they're not on the team, they know going in why it's being changed. And also standard work, over standardization is as damaging as under standardization. So the standardization has to be smart standardization. And if it's done well, it is smart, and any worker loves smart standardization because it makes their work easier. If you've made their work more difficult, it's probably a little bit of a failure there on the improvement side. So that's my 2 cents. It's a good question. It's a longer conversation. Train the trainer, yes, I think it's very effective when you have a large global organization. It's kind of the only way is train the trainer, so yes. And I've got to run also. Everyone's like, gotta run. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you next month on the webinar that's going to talk about how do you choose value stream mapping over process level or metrics-based process mapping. How do you choose which level to map, when and why? So thank you. We'll have the recordings up on YouTube, SlideShare, Vimeo, and the website within 24 hours. The materials will be on SlideShare. Please share, tell everyone, and we'll see you next time. Have a great morning, evening, or night, wherever you are, afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.